Thank you. May we all find some solace in the light of our chalice. Our speaker today is Mike Ivey, and the topic of his speech is freedom from religion. Thank you, Mike.
Well, gee, applause before I say anything. That's probably best. Okay, let me see. I always have trouble getting the microphone in the right place where I can still read. Okay, so in the United States, we value the principle of freedom of religion. This freedom is guaranteed by a very concise statement in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. All laws and precedents concerning religious freedom in the U.S. derive from this one sentence. The history of religious freedom is an interesting subject. It was generally the policy in ancient Greece and India. The ancient Hebrews, on the other hand, tended to murder people who practiced other religions. Intolerance was also the norm in Europe after the rise of the Catholic Church. Many of the first colonists who came to North America were seeking religious freedom for themselves. They were mostly intolerant, often violently so, of other beliefs. Pennsylvania was a notable exception, granting religious freedom to all. A few other colonies had more limited concepts of tolerance. But today I want to talk about the current status of religious freedom here and elsewhere. I sometimes hear people complain that freedom of religion isn't sufficient. They long for freedom from religion. They want to live their lives without having to encounter religion at all. They want a purely secular society. Secularism is the idea that religion should be excluded from civil affairs in general and government in particular. In its broadest sense, it includes both freedom of and freedom from religion. It's best thought of as a continuum rather than a specific set of practices. I want to talk about how the principle of secularism is put into practice in a few other countries. Religious freedom in Canada is guaranteed in the 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Although, ironically, the preamble to the Charter includes the statement that Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. This statement has no legal significance and is generally regarded as an embarrassment. The Canadian government has been pretty rigorous in keeping church and state separate. In a 1999 case concerning the recitation of the Lord's Prayer at town council meetings, the Ontario Court of Appeal interpreted religious freedom to include, quote, freedom to practice your religion of choice, freedom from direct or indirect pressure to act contrary to your beliefs, and freedom from pressure to conform with a religious majority. The court found that the purpose of reciting the Lord's Prayer was to impose a Christian moral tone on council meetings. This practice pressured non-believers to conform with the majority. The courts have also ruled that government employees may not refuse to perform a same-sex marriage that conflicts with their personal beliefs. And a 2019 law prohibits government officials in positions of authority from wearing religious symbols at work. This law has been applied to teachers, prohibiting the wearing of a hijab, turban, yarmulke, or other religious clothing in the classroom. The law is controversial and is still being appealed. On the other hand, the government enforces a requirement of reasonable accommodation for religious practices in other contexts. Employers, service providers, and landlords are required to accommodate a person's practice of their religion so long as it doesn't impose undue hardship or create unsafe conditions. For example, some municipalities provide for separation of men and women in their public swimming pool a few hours a week to accommodate observant Muslims. And employees of most businesses are entitled to observe their religious holidays and are generally allowed to dress in accordance with their religious practices. But a construction worker of the Sikh religion is not permitted to wear his turban instead of a hard hat because of safety requirements. Secularism in Germany is very different and a bit complicated. The German Constitution and laws deriving from it guarantee individual religious freedom. One may profess and practice any religion or no religion without fear of discrimination. Philosophical beliefs are granted the same status as religious beliefs in this context. These rights are generally well protected by the courts. However, the situation can be confusing because of state laws that differ with one another. For example, in some locations, but not others, teachers are forbidden to wear religious symbols. Sometimes these laws are rather selectively enforced. But where the German approach to secularism gets complicated is in the relationship of the government to religious organizations rather than to individuals. The official position is that the government must be neutral in its dealings with religious organizations, but it often has fallen short of that goal. Religious organizations in Germany may incorporate as nonprofit corporations and receive substantial tax benefits. But for decades, the government has attempted to use various criteria to determine which groups would be officially recognized as legitimate religious organizations. The criteria have usually favored the larger, long-established religions. Smaller, less mainstream religions have sometimes had to fight for recognition. Gradually, the courts have rejected most government requirements for recognition. Jehovah's Witnesses most recently gained official recognition after decades of legal battles. The Church of Scientology is still not recognized as a legitimate religion. The financial relationship between church and state gets even more complicated when you consider that religious organizations are legally entitled to impose a tax on all their members and to have the tax collected for them by the government. And then there's a requirement that all public school students take classes in religion. These are not a general introduction to world religions. They are instruction in specific religious beliefs taught by representatives of the major religions in Germany. Parents may choose instruction in Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, or Jewish beliefs. Muslim instruction is also now an option in some locations. For families with different religious beliefs, or none at all, there's the option of an ethics class that is based in philosophy rather than religion. So in several ways, church and state are not well separated in Germany. Excuse me. India also considers itself a secular country, but religion is important to most Indians. About 80% are Hindu, 14% Muslim, and 2% Christian. Buddhists, Sikhs, Jains, and Jews each account for less than 2%. The Indian Constitution declares it to be a secular state. As in Germany, this means maintaining neutrality in the way government interacts with religious groups. Individuals are guaranteed freedom of conscience and the freedom to profess and practice any religion, or none at all. Religious groups are guaranteed the right to manage their own religious affairs. This has led to several legal ambiguities when the practices of a particular religion are at odds with civil law in such matters as marriage, divorce, inheritance, or education. Often these conflicts involve Muslims, and the government tends to allow them to follow Sharia law, causing some Hindus to complain that Indian law is not applied uniformly and impartially to all citizens. Some Muslim women make the same complaint because they are not able to exercise all the rights of other Indian women. There are also objections from Buddhists, Sikhs, and Jains that they are all legally considered Hindus because their religions arose within Hinduism, even though their beliefs and practices differ. Generally, the Indian government takes a hands-off approach to religion, but there are exceptions. There's a clause in the Constitution that makes it a criminal offense to kill a cow. And the government provides financial support for the preservation and maintenance of historic places of worship. And although religious instruction is prohibited in public schools, the government does provide some financial support for private religious schools. Despite its attempts to create a harmonious, pluralistic society, India has had many instances of violent conflict between religious groups, usually between the Hindu majority and Muslims or one of the other minorities. There is a very vocal Hindu nationalist movement in India. Finally, let's look at secularism in France, one of the most secular countries in the world, and proud of it. Legally, there is absolute separation of civil and religious life. The government is to have no influence over religion, and religion is to have no influence over government. Religious values are replaced with secular values. The government does not acknowledge any religion. Religion is considered a personal, individual matter. Individuals have complete freedom of belief, whether religious or philosophical. They are free to practice any religion they choose, in private. Religion, rather like sex, is not something you should do in public. People find it embarrassing or even offensive. Public life is expected to reflect the secular values of the French Republic. There is no such thing as reasonable accommodation for religious beliefs or practices. All citizens are treated equally, meaning that they are treated as if religion does not exist. The government has taken several steps to ban visible forms of religious expression in public. All forms of religiously symbolic clothing are banned for both students and teachers in public schools, including universities. The French education minister stated, "When you walk into a classroom, you shouldn't be able to identify the pupil's religion just by looking at them." More than 100 teenage students have been suspended or expelled for wearing the hijab. A 2010 law prohibits wearing any clothing that conceals the face in any public place. Debate on the law before it was passed made it clear that it was directed at Muslim women. Women who have defied the ban were convicted and fined. Several local governments attempted to ban the full coverage swimming attire used by some Muslim women, resulting in a few arrests, but these laws were eventually overturned by the courts. There is obviously an ongoing ideological conflict between the French government and some French Muslims. There is also some anti-Muslim sentiment among the French people. There are approximately 5 million Muslims in France, making them the second largest religious group after Catholics. There are far more Muslims than Protestants or Jews. Most of the Muslims are immigrants or children of immigrants, and anti-immigrant sentiments are definitely a factor. And there have been incidents of deadly violence perpetrated by Islamic extremists, giving rise to fear and suspicion. But it appears that the main source of conflict with Muslims is that their religion is conspicuous. This offends the secular government and citizens who support secularism. There are approximately 1 million Buddhists in France, mostly immigrants, but they experience little or no conflict with the government or the secular society because their religion is not conspicuously displayed. Freedom from religion in France significantly limits freedom of religion. So, what have I learned from my little excursion into secularism? Mainly that all versions of secularism will inevitably encounter problems. Often there are conflicting rights to try to reconcile, and always questions of fairness. It can even be hard to determine whether a policy furthers or undermines secular values. Should religious organizations have tax exemptions? From one point of view, this separates religion from the authority of the state, authority that could potentially be used in coercive or punitive ways. It maintains a hands-off policy. On the other hand, these organizations are receiving special treatment specifically because they are religious. And it puts the government in the position of passing judgment on which groups are truly religious and entitled to those benefits. And in a sense, it requires taxpayers to subsidize religion because the lost tax revenue has to be made up by everybody else. Should someone be exempt from military service because of their religious beliefs? Should the government decide which religious beliefs are acceptable for being exempt? Some religious organizations provide charitable services to the community, such as food, shelter, or clothing for people in need. Is it appropriate for the government to give financial support for this kind of work? What if the assistance is accompanied by preaching or prayer? How about reasonable accommodation for a person's religion? If my religious beliefs prohibit me from working on the Sabbath, should my employer be expected to give me that day off every week? Or should I have to choose between my religion and my source of income? Or what if I'm the employer being asked to accommodate several workers with similar requests? Is it fair to let them have every Saturday or Sunday off, whichever the case may be, and require other employees to work every weekend in their place? What about clothing? Should teachers be forbidden to wear clothing associated with their religion? Should students? What about other symbols? Is there a difference between wearing a hijab and wearing a crucifix? How about dreadlocks? Religious symbol or fashion statement? Any restriction on a person's expression of their religion obviously limits their freedom of religion. Is there sufficient cause to justify it? Are students harmed by a teacher or another student wearing a religious symbol? Being exposed to racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity is generally thought to be good for children. Is religion necessarily in a different category? What should be the relationship between government laws and moral values based on religion? Traditionally, religious moral codes have had a strong influence on laws. These influences have gradually been reduced. Only recently, religious doctrine was eliminated from our definition of marriage, but not completely. There are still laws prohibiting polygamy. And finally, I have to mention the sometimes successful efforts to deliberately incorporate religion into government. I'm referring, of course, to such things as posting the 10 Commandments in government buildings, displaying "In God We Trust" on police cars, and opening government meetings with a prayer. In Tennessee, license plates say "In God We Trust," unless you request the alternate version without it. The arrangement of numbers and letters is different on the two tags, making it easy to tell at a glance who is a member of the in-group and who is a godless heathen. While nobody is seriously harmed by such nonsense, these efforts to undermine the separation of church and state are a threat to any form of secularism. Personally, I believe strongly in keeping religion out of government. I also value religious diversity and freedom of expression, so I believe government should not try to regulate religion. But as they say, the devil is in the details. Thank you.